The community center smelled of burnt coffee and damp carpet, a tired haze hanging over the folding chairs arranged in uneven rows. Eleanor Grayson stood at the back, her thin frame half hidden by a sagging coat rack, her arms crossed tight against her chest. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a sterile glow on the 40-odd neighbors who filled the space, some perched stiffly, others slouched with the casual indifference of people who'd already picked a side. She felt every glance that darted her way, quick and sharp like pinpricks, though most eyes lingered longer on the man at the front, Victor Hensley, the developer with a smile too polished to trust. His tailored suit gleamed under the lights, a stark contrast to the faded linoleum floor, and his presence seemed to suck the air from the room, leaving it heavy with expectation. The meeting had been called to seal her fate. Eleanor's little house on Maple Street, 2 bedrooms, a sagging porch, roses clawing up the trellis, stood in the way of Victor's vision, a row of sleek condos with glass balconies and price tags no one local could afford. For weeks, the neighborhood association had circulated a petition to force her out, their signatures piling up like stones on a grave. Her yard, overgrown since Tom's death 5 years back, had become their rallying cry, an eyesore, they called it, a blight on property values. The peeling paint and cracked walkway didn't help her case. To them, she was a widow past her prime, 62 and shrinking into herself, a woman who'd let the world move on without her. They didn't see the way her hands still knew how to prune a bush, or the quiet pride she took in the home she'd shared with Tom for 3 decades. They saw weakness, and Victor smelled blood. He stood at the podium, a stack of glossy flyers beside him, his hair slicked back with the confidence of a man who'd never lost a fight. His assistant, Paul, hovered nearby, a wiry figure with a pinched face and restless hands, passing out those flyers like propaganda. The images showed gleaming buildings rising where Eleanor's roses now bloomed, a sterile promise of progress that made her stomach twist. The room leaned into Victor's orbit, their murmurs a low hum of agreement. Mrs. Carter, the only exception, sat in the corner, her knitting needles clicking steadily through the tension. She'd always had a soft spot for Eleanor, dropping off jars of jam when Tom passed, but her quiet kindness wouldn't sway a crowd this riled up. The rest, the young couple from down the street, the retired banker with his perpetual frown, the association chair with her crisp blazer, had already judged her. Outmatched. Incapable. Done. Eleanor's fingers tightened around her arms, the fabric of her coat bunching under her grip. She'd worn her best sweater, a faded green thing Tom had liked, but it felt flimsy against the weight of their stares. The room pulsed with a certainty she couldn't shake. They thought she'd fold. Victor's plan wasn't just about her house, it was about erasing her, turning her life into a footnote in his march toward profit. The petition had started as whispers, complaints about her untended lawn, rumors she'd dodged property taxes, but it had grown into something uglier, a collective shove to push her out. She'd heard the snatches of conversation as she'd walked in, mutters about her being too old to fight, too alone to matter. The banker had even smirked as he'd taken his seat, his eyes skimming over her like she was already gone. Victor's presence dominated the space, his posture relaxed yet commanding, a predator playing at civility. He'd framed the eviction as a favor, a generous buyout for a woman who couldn't keep up, a chance to shuffle off to some subsidized apartment and leave the future to him. The association lapped it up, their nods a silent chorus of approval. They didn't care that the house held the echo of Tom's laugh or the scuff marks from the furniture they'd built together. To them, it was just a plot of land, a stepping stone for Victor's empire. Paul's smirk widened as he handed out the last flyer, his movements quick and smug, a shadow to his boss's spotlight. The flyers landed in laps with a soft thud, each one a brick in the wall closing her in. Eleanor's chest tightened, a familiar ache blooming where grief and defiance tangled. She'd never been one for crowds. Tom had been the talker, the one who'd charm a room while she watched from the sidelines. But standing there, she felt the stir of something older, something he'd left her. The memory of his voice, rough and steady, flickered in her mind. Don't let them bury you, Ellie. She shifted her weight, the soles of her worn shoes gripping the floor. They saw a widow, a relic, a pushover. They didn't know about the hours she'd spent with Tom in muddy fields, learning the language of land and lines, or the stubborn streak she'd buried under years of quiet. Victor's confidence, Paul's sneer, the room's certainty, it all pressed down on her. But beneath it, a spark flared. She wasn't done yet. The meeting stretched on, the air growing warmer, thicker, as Victor laid out his case with the ease of a man who'd already won. The crowd settled into their roles, judge, jury, executioner, while Eleanor stood apart, a ghost in her own story. But ghosts could haunt, couldn't they? Her eyes flicked to the clock above the podium, its hands ticking toward a reckoning she hadn't planned but could feel coming. The letter was still a secret then, tucked away in her attic, waiting to change everything. For now, she was just the woman they'd written off, the obstacle they'd underestimated. Soon they'd see. The attic was a cave of shadows and stale air. It sent a heavy blend of dust, mothballs, and the faint, bitter tang of aged wood. Eleanor Grayson climbed the ladder with a slowness born of necessity, her joints protesting each step after 2 sleepless nights since the community meeting. Victor Hensley's polished smirk lingered in her mind, a phantom taunting her alongside the neighbors' cold stares and the petition that threatened to strip her of her home. She'd come up here chasing a lifeline, her savings too meager to fend off the property tax demands, her options reduced to whatever she could unearth and sell. The ladder creaked under her weight, a groan echoing through the narrow hatch, and as she pulled herself into the attic, the darkness pressed in, broken only by the faint hum of a single bulb swinging from its cord. She tugged the chain, and a weak, jaundiced light sputtered to life, spilling across a landscape of forgotten things. The space was a mausoleum of her past, cluttered with relics she'd avoided since Tom's death 5 years ago. Cardboard boxes sagged under their own weight, their corners softened by time, while a cracked mirror leaned against the rafters, its surface clouded with grime. A trunk sat in the corner, its leather peeling like old skin, a hulking shadow Tom had dragged up here in their early years together. The floorboards beneath her feet were warped, gritty with dust that swirled in the dim glow as she shuffled forward. Her knees ached as she lowered herself beside the trunk, the cold seeping through her worn slacks. She'd dressed in a hurry, Tom's old sweater, a faded green that still smelled faintly of him when she pressed it to her face, and a pair of slippers too thin for this chill. The latch on the trunk was stiff, rusted from disuse, and her fingers fumbled with it until it gave way with a reluctant snap. Inside lay a tangle of his life, preserved in disarray. A flannel shirt, its red plaid dulled to a whisper, brushed her hand, and she froze, the texture pulling her back to mornings when he'd worn it, coffee steaming between them on the porch. Beneath it, a stack of surveyor's journals rested, their pages curling at the edges, filled with his meticulous notes from jobs long past. A broken compass gleamed dully in the pile, its needle frozen north, a relic from the days he'd dragged her through muddy fields to map the world. Her chest tightened, a raw ache blooming where grief had carved its permanent home. She'd come for something practical, a watch, maybe, or those fishing lures he'd treasured. But her hands lingered, tracing the contours of his absence, each item a thread to a life she'd let gather dust. The bulb flickered, its light wavering as she pushed aside a bundle of wool scarves, their fibers catching on her calluses. The attic's silence was a weight, broken only by the distant creak of the house settling below and the faint rustle of her own breath. Beneath the scarves, something caught the light, a small tin box, its surface tarnished to a muted silver, no bigger than a loaf of bread. Her pulse quickened as she lifted it, the metal cool against her palms, and she pried it open with a tremble she couldn't suppress. The hinges squealed, a sharp protest against the stillness, and inside lay an envelope, its edges brittle and yellowed, the ink on the front faded but unmistakable. Tom's handwriting, sharp and slanted, spelling out, "To Ellie," in a scrawl that hit her like a fist. She lifted it with care, as if it might dissolve under her touch, and unfolded a single page, its creases deep from years of waiting. The date at the top, 10 years back, when the cancer had begun its slow theft, stared up at her, a timestamp from the final months when he'd known the end was near. The words were spare, written in his blunt style, but they carried his voice, rough-edged, warm, the way he'd sounded calling her in from the yard. He'd written of her strength, a toughness he'd seen when she hadn't, a resilience he'd nurtured through years of quiet lessons. The letter wasn't a farewell. It was a charge, a recognition of a fix he'd foreseen, a world that would try to crush her under its rules. And then, the spark, a line about the knack she carried, the one he'd drilled into her, a push to wield it when the moment demanded. Folded inside was a sketch, its paper worn thin but the lines precise, a map of their lot on Maple Street, inked in his jagged hand, with notes circling a corner. Check the 1923 plat. Floodplain's misdrawn. They'll never see it coming. Eleanor's breath caught, her fingers tightening around the page as the attic seemed to tilt. The bulb buzzed faintly, its light a frail pulse against the shadows pressing in from the rafters. She saw him in the map's lines, those sharp cheekbones, the glint in his eye when he'd solved a riddle no one else could crack. Memories flooded back, vivid and unbidden, 30 years ago, tromping through wet fields, his boots sinking into the earth as he pointed out boundary stakes and easements, his voice patient as he explained how land could lie. How men like Victor could twist it for profit. She'd followed him, half laughing at her own clumsy questions, never imagining she'd need those lessons. But the knack had taken root, buried deep beneath layers of grief and routine, waiting for this moment to break through. The tin box rested heavy in her lap, its edges digging into her thighs as the letter trembled in her grip. The attic's chill wrapped around her, raising goosebumps on her arms. But a warmth stirred too, a flicker of purpose she hadn't felt since he'd slipped away. Victor's condos, the association's disdain, the threat to her roses and her porch, it all loomed larger now, a storm gathering strength. But so did she. The letter was more than ink and paper. It was a weapon, a map to fight back, a piece of Tom reaching across the years to steady her. Her eyes traced the sketch again, the floodplain notes a quiet promise of leverage she could use. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the attic window with a low, mournful howl that seeped through the cracked pane. Eleanor shifted, the floorboards groaning beneath her as she sat back on her heels, the tin box still cradled close. The bulb dimmed again, its light faltering, but she didn't need it to see what came next. The county records office held maps like the one Tom had flagged, dusty files she could unearth, proof she could turn into a shield. Her knees popped as she rose, the ache in her joints dulled by a rising resolve. She tucked the letter and map into the box, its weight a comfort against her chest as she moved toward the ladder. The attic, once a graveyard of loss, thrummed with something new, Tom's faith in her, a ghost stirring her awake. Tomorrow, she'd chase the thread he'd left, dig into the past to save her future, and unravel Victor's game one careful step at a time. The county records office sat on the edge of town, a squat brick building with peeling paint and windows clouded by years of neglect. Eleanor stepped inside the next morning, the tin box tucked under her arm, her coat still damp from a drizzle that had streaked the streets. The air carried a musty weight, old paper, mildew, and the faint metallic tang of filing cabinets left to rust. A fluorescent strip flickered overhead, its hum a constant drone as she crossed the linoleum floor, her slippers traded for sturdy boots that thudded softly with each step. The clerk at the desk barely glanced up from her crossword, her pen scratching lazily, but Eleanor didn't pause for permission. She'd woken with Tom's letter burning in her mind, its map and cryptic notes a lifeline she couldn't ignore, and now she was here to chase it down. The records room stretched out behind a glass door, its shelves groaning under the weight of binders, ledgers, and rolled maps, a labyrinth of the county's past. Dust motes swirled in the slanted light filtering through a high window, catching on her sweater as she moved deeper in. Her fingers brushed the spines of faded folders, their labels curling at the edges, tax rolls, deeds, plats from decades long buried. She'd come armed with a plan. The 1923 plat Tom had flagged etched into her memory, but the sheer volume of it all pressed against her chest, a quiet challenge to the resolve she'd carried from the attic. Her knees ached from the climb down that ladder, her hands still stiff from clutching the tin box, but she squared her shoulders and started at the far end, where the oldest record slept. The hours blurred into a rhythm of searching, her boots scuffing the floor as she hauled down heavy volumes and unrolled brittle maps across a scarred wooden table. The paper crackled under her touch, its edges flaking like dry leaves, and the ink had faded to a ghostly brown, but she traced each line with a focus she hadn't felt in years. Tom's lessons echoed in her head, his voice steady as he'd taught her to spot a surveyor's trick, to read the land's secrets in curves and angles. She saw his hands in her own now, weathered but sure, guiding her through the chaos of overlapping plats and handwritten notes. The room's chill seeped into her bones, the damp air clinging to her skin, but a warmth grew too, a flicker of the knack he'd left her, stirring awake as she worked. The 1923 plat wasn't easy to find. She sifted through stacks of misfiled surveys, their dates jumping from the 40s to the 80s and back, the county's carelessness a tangle she had to unravel. Her eyes strained under the dim light, the flickering bulb casting shadows that danced across the table, but she pressed on, her breath shallow with a mix of frustration and hope. A ledger from 1920 caught her eye, its cover warped from moisture, and she flipped through it, the pages sticking together until she pried them apart. Tucked inside was a folded sheet, larger than the rest, its title scrawled in a clerk's tight hand. Maple Street Subdivision, 1923. Her pulse quickened as she spread it out, the table creaking under its weight. And there it was, the floodplain shaded in a faint crosshatch, sprawling across her lot in a way the modern surveys had conveniently erased. Eleanor's fingers traced the lines, her breath catching as Tom's sketch flashed in her mind. The map matched his notes, the floodplain's boundaries misdrawn in later versions to shrink it, to make her land buildable for Victor's condos. She leaned closer, the paper's musty scent sharp in her nose, and spotted a surveyor's mark in the corner, a name she didn't recognize, but one she'd bet had ties to the developers who'd redrawn it in the 90s. The room seemed to hum with her discovery, the shelves looming like silent witnesses as she pulled out a notebook from her coat pocket. Her handwriting was shaky but deliberate, copying the plat's details, the floodplain's exact measurements, the discrepancies that could undo Victor's plans. The clerk wandered in once, her crossword abandoned, her brows knitting as she watched Eleanor hunched over the table. The older woman's presence was a fleeting shadow, her footsteps retreating without a word, but Eleanor felt the weight of being seen, judged, maybe, as a fool chasing ghosts. She didn't care. The records room was her battlefield now, its dusty chaos a proving ground for the knack Tom had drilled into her. She cross-checked the 1923 plat against flood records from a nearby binder, their pages yellowed and brittle, and found the proof she needed. The original lines were legally binding, tied to codes Victor couldn't dodge. Her chest swelled, a quiet triumph threading through the exhaustion that tugged at her limbs. The light outside had shifted by the time she finished, the drizzle giving way to a gray dusk that pressed against the window. Eleanor gathered her evidence. Photocopies she'd made on a wheezing machine in the corner, the notebook filled with her notes, the 1923 plat rolled tight and slipped into a cardboard tube she'd scavenged from a shelf. Her hands were smudged with ink and dust, her sweater dusted with flakes of old paper, but she stood taller now, the ache in her knees a distant hum beneath a rising certainty. The room's stillness wrapped around her, broken only by the faint drip of a leak somewhere in the ceiling, a steady pulse that matched her own. She thought of Tom as she packed up, his sharp grin when he'd cracked a tough survey, the way he'd nudge her to see what he saw. He'd known she'd need this someday, had buried the seed of it in her when she'd thought it was just his hobby spilling over. The records office, with its sagging shelves and forgotten files, had given her the tools to fight back, not just for her house, but for the life he'd built with her, the roses she'd tended, the porch where they'd watched storms roll in. Her evidence was a shield, a way to turn Victor's game against him, and she felt it in her bones now. She wasn't the widow they'd written off. The clerk glanced up as Eleanor passed the desk, her pen hovering over the crossword. But Eleanor didn't stop. The tin box was still under her arm, Tom's letter and map a talisman against the cold seeping through the door. Outside, the air was sharp, the streetlights buzzing to life as she stepped into the evening, her boots steady on the wet pavement. The meeting loomed ahead, a showdown she could taste, and she'd be ready. The records room had given her more than proof. It had given her back a piece of herself, a strength she'd forgotten she carried. Victor wouldn't see it coming, and that was the point. The community center buzzed with a restless energy, its air thicker now than it had been 2 weeks ago, laden with the scent of burnt coffee and the faint musk of too many bodies pressed into a small space. Eleanor stood near the front this time, no longer tucked behind the coat rack, her boots planted firm on the linoleum floor. The tin box rested at her feet, its weight a quiet anchor, while the cardboard tube with the 1923 plat hung under her arm, her notebook and photocopies clutched tight in a folder against her chest. The folding chairs were filled again, the same 40 neighbors shifting and murmuring, their faces a mix of curiosity and fatigue. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a harsh glare that caught on Victor Hensley's polished suit as he leaned against the podium, his posture loose with the confidence of a man who'd already won. The room's attention orbited him, drawn to the stack of glossy flyers Paul handed out with a smirk, their edges crisp with images of condos that promised a future Maple Street without her. Victor's hair gleamed under the lights, slicked back with a precision that matched the sharp lines of his jaw, and his presence filled the space like a storm cloud, heavy and inevitable. Paul hovered at his side, wiry and restless, his fingers twitching as he scanned the crowd, his smirk a silent taunt aimed at her. The association chair, Linda, sat at a table to the right, her blazer crisp and her pen poised over a clipboard, her stern face a mask of impartiality that didn't fool Eleanor. The petition had grown since last time, its pages thicker with signatures, a noose tightened by whispers of her neglect and the taxes she'd supposedly dodged. They saw her as finished, 62, alone, a widow too frail to fight. She felt their certainty in the air, a weight that pressed against her ribs, but her hands were steady now, her pulse a slow drumbeat beneath the storm. The meeting had dragged through updates and small grievances, streetlights out, a pothole on Elm, before Victor took the floor, his stride to the podium a performance of effortless control. The crowd hushed, leaning into his orbit, their murmurs fading as he laid out his case with the ease of a man reciting a script. His flyers painted her house as a blight, her yard a scar on their progress, and the buyout as her salvation. Paul's smirk widened as he circled the room, dropping those flyers into laps with a soft thud, each one a brick in the wall they'd built around her. Mrs. Carter knitted in the corner, her needles a steady click through the tension, her eyes flicking up to Eleanor with a quiet warmth that stood alone. The rest, the young couple, the banker with his perpetual frown, nodded along, their agreement a silent tide pulling her under. Eleanor stepped forward as Victor wrapped up, the folder heavy in her hands, her boots scuffing the floor with a sound that cut through the room's hum. The shift was subtle at first, a ripple of turned heads, a pause in the air, but it grew as she reached the projector table at the center. Her coat was still damp from the morning's drizzle, her sweater frayed at the cuffs, but she moved with a purpose that belied the exhaustion tugging at her limbs. She slid the 1923 plat from its tube, its paper crackling as she unrolled it across the table, the photocopies and notebook stacked beside it. The bulb overhead flickered, casting jagged shadows over the map's faded lines, and the room's attention snagged on her, a mix of skepticism and surprise threading through the crowd. Victor's smile faltered, a crack in his polished mask, his eyes narrowing as she smoothed the plat flat. Paul froze mid-step, a flyer dangling from his fingers, his smirk replaced by a twitch of unease. The map sprawled across the table, its floodplain shaded in a faint crosshatch that swallowed her lot, a truth the modern surveys had buried. Eleanor's hands moved with a precision Tom had taught her, pointing to the lines as she laid out the evidence, her notebook open to the discrepancies, the flood records photocopied in stark black and white. The room stirred, a low rustle of shifting bodies and caught breaths, as the weight of her findings sank in. Linda's pen stilled, her clipboard forgotten, her stern mask slipping into something closer to shock. Victor's posture stiffened, his hands gripping the podium's edge, his confidence fraying as Eleanor traced the floodplain's original boundaries. The plat matched Tom's sketch, its notes a mirror to her own, and the flood records tied it to codes no developer could skirt. Paul lunged for the projector table, his wiry frame darting forward, but Eleanor shifted the map out of reach, her movements calm and deliberate. The crowd's murmurs swelled, a tide turning against the current Victor had set, their nods replaced by furrowed brows and whispered questions. Mrs. Carter's knitting slowed, her needles pausing as a slow smile curved her lips, a glint of pride breaking through her quiet. The air thickened with a new tension, the fluorescent hum drowned by the rustle of unease. Victor's face reddened, his jaw tight as he scanned the room, searching for an anchor to pull back control. Paul hovered at his side, his hands empty now, his smirk gone as he shrank under the shifting tide. Eleanor stood tall over the table, her evidence a fortress she'd built from dust and memory, her voice silent, but her presence loud enough to fill the space Victor had claimed. The plat's lines were her weapon, the knack Tom had left her a blade she'd sharpened in the records room, and she wielded it with a clarity that cut through their assumptions. Linda rose from her seat, her blazer creasing as she moved to the podium, her clipboard abandoned on the table. The meeting's rhythm broke, the crowd's attention splintering between Victor's crumbling certainty and Eleanor's quiet stand. The banker's frown deepened, the young couple leaned forward, and even the stragglers at the back straightened, their indifference giving way to something sharper. Eleanor felt the shift in her bones, a tide she'd turned with the past she'd unearthed, a strength they hadn't seen coming. The room adjourned in a flurry of motion, chairs scraping, voices rising, Victor's glare burning into her back, but she didn't flinch. The tin box sat at her feet, Tom's letter a steady pulse within it, and she knew the fight wasn't over, only redirected. They'd underestimated her, and now they'd pay the price. The drizzle had stopped by the time the planning board's ruling came down, 2 weeks after the community meeting, leaving Maple Street slick and gleaming under a pale April sun. Eleanor stood on her porch, the sagging boards creaking beneath her boots, the tin box resting on the railing beside a chipped mug of tea. The air carried the sharp scent of wet earth and the faint sweetness of her roses, their petals unfurling despite the neglect she'd let creep in. The letter from the county lay open in her lap, its official seal stark against the paper, confirming what she'd fought for. Victor's permits denied, her house safe, the floodplain's truth upheld. The surveyor he'd hired had a history of adjustments, the board noted, a thread of corruption she'd pulled loose with Tom's map and her own stubborn hands. She traced the letter's edges, her fingers steady now, the ache in her knees a quiet hum beneath a peace she hadn't felt in years. The neighborhood had shifted in those 2 weeks, a slow unraveling of the tide that had nearly swept her away. The association's petition dissolved, its pages abandoned after Linda's clipped announcement at the next meeting, her blazer less crisp as she'd read the board's decision to a hushed room. Victor's glossy flyers vanished from mailboxes, his sleek car no longer parked at the curb, his shadow lifted from Maple Street. Paul's wiry frame hadn't been seen either, his smirk erased by the fallout of a plan that had crumbled under Eleanor's evidence. The banker from down the street had shuffled past her house the day before, his frown softened as he'd tipped his hat, a gesture she hadn't expected. The young couple waved now when they walked their dog, their nods tentative but real, a crack in the wall they'd built around her. Mrs. Carter had been the first to bridge the gap, arriving that morning with a jar of strawberry jam and a quilt she'd finished, its stitches tight and warm. She'd lingered on the porch steps, her knitting needles tucked away, her eyes crinkling with a pride that needed no words. The jam sat on Eleanor's kitchen table now, its glass catching the light beside Tom's letter, a quiet tether to the woman who'd seen her when no one else had. Others followed, casseroles left on her doorstep, a note from the retired teacher across the way, even a mumbled apology from the association's treasurer as he'd handed her a refund for dues she'd overpaid. The gestures were small, clumsy, but they carried a weight she felt in her chest, a ripple from the stand she'd taken that reached beyond her yard. Eleanor leaned against the railing, the wood rough under her palms, and let her gaze drift over the street. The roses climbed the trellis in tangled bursts of red, their thorns a silent defiance against the mower Victor had wanted to send. The paint on her house still peeled, the walkway still cracked, but it stood, hers, unbroken, a testament to the life she'd built with Tom. She saw him in the lines of it all, the porch where he'd sipped coffee, the garden he'd mapped with his surveyor's eye, the home he'd left her to defend. The tin box gleamed faintly in the sun, its contents a bridge between then and now, and she felt his presence in the stillness, a rough laugh she could almost hear on the wind. The victory wasn't loud, no headlines, no crowds, but it settled deep, a quiet shift in the world she'd known. The planning board's ruling had exposed more than Victor's greed. It had cracked open a fault line in the neighborhood's rush to progress, a reminder of what they'd traded for his promises. The banker's hat tip, the couple's wave, Mrs. Carter's jam, they were threads of a fabric rewoven, a community forced to look at her and see more than a widow past her prime. She turned their game upside down with a skill they'd never suspected, a knack buried in dusty maps and 30 years of listening to Tom. The floodplain's truth had saved her house, but it was her hands, steady, sure, guided by his lessons, that had saved her place in their eyes. The sun dipped lower, painting the street in soft gold, and Eleanor sipped her tea, its warmth seeping into her bones. The mug was one of Tom's, chipped from a morning he'd dropped it laughing, and she held it close, a grounding weight against the day's quiet triumph. She thought of the attic where it had started, the letter that had woken her, the records room where she'd forged her shield. Each step had been hers, a path she'd carved when support had faltered, when the room had mocked her, when Victor's certainty had loomed unbeatable. They'd seen a relic, a pushover, but she'd shown them a fighter 62, alone, but never weak. A breeze rustled the roses, their scent rising sharp and sweet, and she heard footsteps on the sidewalk, Mrs. Carter again, her coat buttoned tight, pausing to wave before heading home. The older woman's smile lingered in the air, a mirror to the shift Eleanor felt in herself. She wasn't just the widow on Maple Street anymore. She was the one who'd stood, who'd known, who'd won. The neighborhood would carry that now, a story whispered over fences and coffee cups, a challenge to the assumptions they'd worn like blinders. She'd saved more than her house. She'd saved a piece of what it meant to belong, to endure, to matter. Eleanor set the mug down, the letter still open beside it, and let her hands rest on the railing. The street stretched out before her, its houses quiet under the fading light, its rhythm slower now, less certain of its rush to erase her. Tom's map had been the spark, but her fight had lit the flame, and its glow reached further than she'd dreamed. She'd turned the tables not just on Victor, but on a world that had underestimated her, and in the stillness, she felt the ripple of it, small, steady, undeniable. The roses nodded in the breeze, the porch held her weight, and she stood there, rooted, a woman they'd never bury again.